Hello and good day. Today's topic is to learn about the imaginary numbers under the lesson Classification of Numbers included in the arithmetic. After finishing this tutorial, we will learn what is imaginary number and what is meant by imaginary number. One thing to keep in mind is that this tutorial is part of the classification of numbers. From the previous tutorial, we have learned that initially number can be divided into two classes. The first is called real number and the other is called imaginary number. Although we all have ideas about real numbers, but not all of us are familiar with imaginary numbers. So now we will try to understand what is meant by imaginary or unreal number. The definition of imaginary number. An imaginary number is a number that, when squared, gives a negative result. Basically, an imaginary number is the square root of a negative number and has no real value. Before we begin, our first question is, can you think of a number whose square results in a negative number? Let us rephrase the question in a simpler form. Is it possible to get a negative number as an outcome if a number is multiplied by itself? Think about it. By this time, you may have thought of something. Let's see a little details now. We know that, to put it simply, multiplying a positive number by exactly the same positive number gives us the positive squared number. For example, 3 times 3 is equal to 9. Again, if we multiply a negative number by exactly the same negative number, we get a positive squared number. For example, negative 3 times negative 3 is equal to 9. Again, if we multiply the negative square root of 3 with the negative square root of 3, then we get positive 3. Our luck is not very favorable because we still cannot think of a number whose squares result in a negative number. Let's try to understand a little bit more. More or less, all of us have studied the quadratic equation in the middle school, and from that we know that if x squared minus 9 is equal to 0, then the value of x will be equal to positive 3 or negative 3. Now let us try to find the value of x squared plus 1 equal to 0. The answer is we cannot get anything. Do you think there is a solution? There is no reason for you to worry if you do not find the answer to this question. A closer look reveals that when any number, suppose we square x, the result will be a positive number. In that case, the value of x is either a positive real number or any negative number. Still, the outcome will be a positive number. We always get a positive number in both cases. That is, there is no number in the real world that can be multiplied by itself to get a negative number. Therefore, any negative number, let's assume the number is negative 9. Its square root will be an imaginary or unreal number. Do you remember that using the formula to find the solution of quadratic equation we used in our middle school? It clearly states that if the value of b square minus 4ac of that equation is negative, then there is no real square root of quadratic equation. However, let us explore the history a little bit. In the 16th century, there was a mathematician named Cardan who first started thinking about the solution of quadratic equation of negative numbers. Others soon followed him. But in the 18th century, there was a mathematician named Euler who gave the square root of a negative unit. Here he defines the negative square root as I, and it is further defined as the unit of imaginary number. It was said because it was supposed to be imaginary and what we also imagined. That is, the square of I is equal to negative 1. Now we come back to our first question. Can you imagine a number whose square results in a negative number? Simply put, the number is a number that multiplies by itself to get a negative number. The answer is I. Provided that if the square of I is equal to the negative 1, or the value of I is equal to the square root of negative 1. In other words, if we multiply the square root of negative 1 by the square root of negative 1, we get a negative 1. So we get a negative number by squaring a number. Our second question was, what is the value of the square of x plus 1 equal to 0? If we take 1 to the right hand side of the equation, we will find that the square of x is equal to negative 1. Now, if we square both sides, of the equation, we get x equal to square root of -1, which means that x is equal to plus minus I. So x square plus 1 equal to 0 equation does not have a real number square root, but this equation has an imaginary number square root, and this is the explanation of imaginary numbers. Currently, the English lowercase italic I is used as a symbol of imaginary or unrealistic numbers, as the imaginary word starts with the character at the beginning with an I and is well known as I equal to square root of 1. The value of I. It turns out that mathematically the square of I is an equal to -1. In other words, the value of I is the square root of -1. Here are some things to keep in mind. I is a non-real number. It is out of the real set. I represents a unit of length on the real direction. I represents the y unit perpendicular to the real direction. X plus iy represents the point or coordinate x, y. I is equal to the square root of the -1, or I square is equal to -1. When we say that I is a non-real number, we do not mean that I does not exist or is just a figment of our imagination. We want to say that I is unreal in the sense that it is not included in the real number set. However, it is a perfectly valid mathematical entity, also known as iota. In the next tutorial, we will look at real numbers. Real numbers can be divided into two parts, one of which is rational numbers and the other is irrational numbers. For the convenience of explanation and understanding, we will first go towards smaller to larger classification. Thank you for watching the tutorial. If you have any question, please send us email to rhkstore@gmail.com or write in comment section. We would appreciate if you subscribe, give us a thumbs up or a like. Please do share with your friends, and to receive new tutorials, do not forget to press the bell icon. Stay home and stay safe.